Ma'am, we've had multiple noise complaints from this
That's not
address.
possible. My home has been quiet.
Ma'am, don't argue with me. This address was
Who made
reported.
the complaint?
That information is none of your
You did
business.
not have permission to enter
Step
my
back right
home.
now. You're being uncooperative.
The doorbell rang at exactly 7:32 in the evening. Judge Rebecca Lawson had just finished reviewing case files for tomorrow's hearings when she heard the chime echo through her quiet suburban home. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her husband was out of town on business, and her adult children lived in different states. Setting down her reading glasses, she walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. Two police officers stood on her porch, their uniforms crisp and badges gleaming under the porch light. The taller officer, a man in his early 40s with graying temples, held a clipboard. His partner, a younger woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood slightly behind him, scanning the neighborhood. Rebecca unlocked the door and opened it partway, keeping the chain latch engaged. She asked if she could help them. The older officer introduced himself as Sergeant David Kane and his partner as Officer Lisa Rodriguez. He said they were responding to a noise complaint from the neighborhood and needed to speak with the homeowner. Rebecca found this odd. Her house had been completely quiet all evening. She had been reading in her study with classical music playing softly in the background. Nothing that could possibly disturb the neighbors. She told the officers that there must be some mistake. Her home had been peaceful all evening, and she lived alone while her husband was traveling. Sergeant Kane looked at his clipboard and read off her address, confirming they were at the right location. He said multiple neighbors had called about loud music and shouting coming from this specific address. Rebecca knew this was impossible. She asked which neighbors had complained, but Kane said he couldn't reveal that information. Something in his tone made her uncomfortable. She had been a judge for 15 years and a prosecutor before that. She knew when something didn't feel right, and this entire interaction felt wrong from the beginning. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because this story takes some incredible turns that you absolutely won't want to miss. What started as a simple noise complaint would end up destroying careers and exposing a corruption scandal that reached the highest levels of local law enforcement. Judge Rebecca Lawson was no ordinary citizen. At 53 years old, she had built an impeccable reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the state. She had presided over high-profile cases involving organized crime, political corruption, and civil rights violations. Her courtroom was known for fairness, thorough preparation, and zero tolerance for misconduct from anyone, including law enforcement officers who tried to bend the truth. She lived in Millbrook Heights, an upscale neighborhood where she had resided for over a decade. Her neighbors knew her well. She hosted annual block parties, contributed to community fundraisers, and maintained her property meticulously. The idea that multiple neighbors would complain about noise from her home was not just unlikely, it was absurd. Standing at her door that evening, Rebecca made a decision that would prove to be crucial. She asked the officers to wait a moment while she grabbed her phone. She wanted to call her immediate neighbors to clarify whether anyone had actually made a complaint. This was a reasonable request from a homeowner trying to understand what was happening. Sergeant Kane's reaction was immediate and telling. He became agitated and told her that wasn't necessary. He said they needed to come inside right now to investigate the noise complaint. When Rebecca asked if they had a warrant, Kane's demeanor shifted completely. His voice became louder and more aggressive. He said they didn't need a warrant for a noise complaint investigation and that she was being uncooperative. Rebecca remained calm but firm. She explained that as she had committed no crime and there was clearly no ongoing disturbance, she would not be allowing them inside without a warrant. She offered to provide her contact information so they could follow up through proper channels if needed. This was when Sergeant Kane made his first major mistake. He placed his foot in her doorway, preventing her from closing the door. Rebecca immediately told him to remove his foot and step back from her property. Instead of complying, Kane pushed the door open, breaking the chain latch. Officer Rodriguez followed him inside without hesitation. What these officers didn't know was that Judge Rebecca Lawson had recently installed a comprehensive security system throughout her home. Multiple cameras with audio recording capabilities covered every room and entrance. Every second of what happened next was being captured in high definition with crystal clear sound quality. Kane demanded that Rebecca produce identification immediately. When she asked why identification was necessary for a noise complaint at her own home, he said she was acting suspicious and they needed to verify she belonged there. The implications of this statement would become clear later, but Rebecca understood immediately what was happening. She calmly walked to her purse and retrieved her driver's license, which clearly showed her name and the address where they were standing. Kane studied the license for an unusually long time before handing it back. He then asked her what she did for work. Rebecca found this question completely inappropriate and irrelevant to any noise complaint, but she answered honestly. She said she was a judge. The reaction from both officers was immediate and unmistakable. Kane's eyes widened and Rodriguez took a step backward. Kane asked her to repeat what she had said. Rebecca clearly stated that she was a circuit court judge and had been for 15 years. She asked again why they were really in her home and demanded to see the complaint report. This is when the situation took a dramatic turn. Instead of apologizing and leaving, Sergeant Kane doubled down. He said he didn't believe she was a judge and demanded additional proof. He said anyone could claim to be anything and that her behavior was still suspicious. Officer Rodriguez began walking through Rebecca's living room, examining her belongings without permission. Rebecca had reached her limit. She firmly told both officers that they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She said she would be filing a formal complaint with their department and that their behavior was completely unacceptable. Kane responded by telling her that she was being belligerent and that he could arrest her for interfering with a police investigation. What happened next would become the centerpiece of multiple federal lawsuits. Rebecca walked to her home office and returned with her judicial identification badge and her business cards. She handed them to Kane, who examined them closely. The badge was official, issued by the state court administration. Her business cards clearly identified her as the Honorable Rebecca Lawson, Circuit Court Judge. Kane looked at the identification for nearly a full minute. Rodriguez peered over his shoulder. Rebecca could see recognition dawning on their faces, but instead of apologizing and leaving, they made another catastrophic decision. Kane claimed the identification could be fake and said they would need to verify her identity through official channels. Rebecca told them they could verify her identity by calling the courthouse, the sheriff's department, or even the mayor's office. Any of these agencies would confirm her position immediately. Instead, Kane said they would need to take her to the station for proper identification verification. At this point, Rebecca knew she was dealing with officers who were either criminally corrupt or dangerously incompetent. She told them clearly that she was not going anywhere and that they were violating multiple laws by remaining in her home. She said she was calling her attorney and the chief of police immediately. Kane responded by telling her she was under arrest for obstruction of justice. Rodriguez moved to her side as if preparing to handcuff her. Rebecca stepped back and loudly stated that she did not consent to any arrest, that no crime had been committed, and that she was a sitting judge being unlawfully detained in her own home. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Rebecca's security cameras captured Kane reaching for his handcuffs while Rodriguez positioned herself behind Rebecca. The audio clearly recorded Rebecca's repeated statements about her judicial position and her demands that the officers leave her property. But Kane and Rodriguez had passed the point of no return. They were committed to a course of action that would destroy their careers and expose a pattern of behavior that had been hidden from public view for years. What they didn't realize was that Judge Rebecca Lawson had been investigating police misconduct in her courtroom for months, and she recognized both of their names from complaints that had crossed her desk. The next few minutes would be captured on multiple camera angles as Rebecca was handcuffed in her own living room by two officers who had no legitimate reason for being there in the first place. The footage would later be played in federal court, analyzed by constitutional law experts, and broadcast on national news programs. Have you ever witnessed police misconduct firsthand? Type yes in the comments if you have, because what happened to Judge Lawson that night was just the beginning of a story that would expose corruption reaching far beyond these two officers. As Kane placed the handcuffs on Rebecca's wrists, she continued to state clearly and calmly that she was a circuit court judge being unlawfully arrested. The irony was lost on neither officer, but they had made their choice. They were going to see this through regardless of the consequences. Consequences. As Rebecca was led to the patrol car in handcuffs, her neighbors began emerging from their homes. Word traveled quickly through Millbrook Heights that something was happening at the judge's house. Several residents pulled out their phones and started recording. Mrs. Henderson from next door called out asking if Rebecca was okay. Mr. Chen from across the street shouted that this had to be some kind of mistake. Sergeant Kane told the gathering crowd to disperse and mind their own business. But these weren't random bystanders. These were Rebecca's neighbors, people who had known her for over a decade. They knew she was a respected judge, and they knew something was terribly wrong with this situation. 3 different neighbors independently called the courthouse emergency line to report that Judge Lawson was being arrested at her home. The drive to the police station was captured on the patrol car's dashboard camera. Rebecca sat in the back seat, still in handcuffs, calmly explaining to the officers that they were making a career-ending mistake. She told them about the security cameras in her home that had recorded everything. She warned them that unlawfully arresting a sitting judge was a federal crime that could result in decades in prison. Kane dismissed her warnings, saying she could tell her stories to the booking officer. Rodriguez remained silent, but the dashboard camera captured her repeatedly, glancing nervously at Kane. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done, but it was far too late to turn back now. At the station, things went from bad to catastrophic. The desk sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Michael Torres, immediately recognized Rebecca when she was brought in. His face went pale as he saw her in handcuffs. Torres had appeared in Rebecca's courtroom dozens of times over the years. He knew exactly who she was and what her arrest would mean for everyone involved. Torres quietly asked Kane to step aside for a private conversation. The lobby cameras captured their heated discussion, though the audio was unclear. Torres was gesturing frantically while Kane appeared defensive and agitated. After several minutes, Torres returned to his desk and began making phone calls. The first was to the chief of police. The second was to the mayor. The third was to the district attorney. Within 30 minutes, the police station lobby looked like a convention of local government officials. The chief of police arrived first, followed quickly by the mayor, the district attorney, and 2 city council members. Each of them took one look at Judge Rebecca Lawson sitting in handcuffs and understood that a political earthquake was about to shake their community. Chief Williams immediately ordered Rebecca's handcuffs removed and personally apologized. He assured her that a full investigation would begin immediately and that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. But Rebecca was far from satisfied. She had been unlawfully arrested in her own home by officers who refused to accept her identification and ignored her repeated explanations of who she was. The chief asked if Rebecca would be willing to discuss the situation privately in his office. She agreed, but only with her attorney present. She called her longtime friend and legal colleague, David Brennan, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the state. Brennan arrived within the hour, and what he found when he reviewed the preliminary reports shocked even his experienced perspective. In the chief's office, Rebecca laid out exactly what had happened from the moment the officers appeared at her door. She described the fabricated noise complaint, the forced entry into her home, the refusal to accept her identification, and the unlawful arrest. Chief Williams listened in growing horror as the details emerged. But the real bombshell came when Rebecca revealed something else. Over the past 6 months, she had been quietly documenting a pattern of misconduct cases involving specific officers in this department. Sergeant Kane's name had appeared in multiple complaints that had crossed her desk. Citizens had filed reports claiming he had targeted them based on racial profiling, conducted illegal searches, and filed false reports. Rebecca had been planning to bring these concerns to the chief's attention through official channels, but now she was a victim of the very misconduct she had been investigating. The irony was staggering, and the legal implications were enormous. Attorney Brennan requested copies of all reports related to the evening's incident, including the original noise complaint. When Chief Williams checked the system, he discovered something that sent shockwaves through the room. There was no noise complaint on file, no neighbors had called, No reports had been generated. The entire premise for the officers' visit to Rebecca's home had been fabricated. This revelation transformed the situation from a case of mistaken identity or poor judgment into clear evidence of criminal behavior. Cain and Rodriguez had intentionally targeted Judge Rebecca Lawson's home under false pretenses. The question that everyone in that room was thinking but afraid to ask was simple: why? The answer would emerge over the following weeks as federal investigators took over the case. What they discovered was a web of corruption that stretched far beyond one night and two officers. Cain had been part of a group within the department that had been systematically targeting successful African-American residents in upscale neighborhoods. Judge Rebecca Lawson was African-American, one of only 3 black judges in the entire circuit. She lived in a predominantly white neighborhood and drove an expensive car. She had been specifically chosen as a target because Cain and his associates couldn't believe that a black woman could legitimately afford to live where she did. The investigation revealed that over the past 2 years, Cain had initiated contact with at least 15 other prominent black residents under various false pretenses. He had conducted illegal searches, filed false reports, and in some cases, made arrests that were later dismissed due to lack of evidence. The pattern was clear, systematic, and thoroughly documented in his own police reports. Federal prosecutors moved quickly once they understood the scope of the conspiracy. Cain was arrested at his home just 5 days after the incident at Rebecca's house. Rodriguez was arrested the same day. Both were charged with civil rights violations, conspiracy, false imprisonment, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The federal charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison for each defendant. But the story was far from over because Cain and Rodriguez weren't acting alone. The investigation expanded to include other officers who had participated in or covered up similar incidents. Phone records revealed that Cain had been in contact with a network of officers across multiple precincts who shared his views and methods. Text messages recovered from his phone contained explicit racial slurs and detailed plans for targeting specific individuals and neighborhoods. One message thread discussed Rebecca specifically, referring to her as an uppity target who needed to be put in her place. The messages revealed that Cain had been watching her home for weeks, learning her routines, and waiting for an opportunity to confront her when she was alone and vulnerable. The depth of the conspiracy shocked even experienced federal investigators. This wasn't a case of individual officers making poor decisions. It was an organized effort to intimidate and harass successful black residents using the power and authority of law enforcement. Judge Rebecca Lawson's arrest had inadvertently exposed one of the most significant police corruption scandals in the state's history. But the personal cost to Rebecca was enormous, and the legal battles were just beginning. The question now was whether the justice system would hold these officers accountable for their crimes and provide meaningful consequences for their actions. As news of the arrests spread through the community, more victims began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The scope of the conspiracy grew larger with each new revelation, and it became clear that what happened to Rebecca was just the tip of a very large iceberg. Large iceberg. The federal investigation moved with unprecedented speed and scope. Within 2 weeks of Rebecca's arrest, FBI agents had executed search warrants on Cain's home, Rodriguez's apartment, and the personal devices of 17 other officers across 4 different precincts. What they found painted a picture of corruption so extensive that even seasoned investigators were stunned by its breadth and organization. Cain's computer contained files with detailed profiles of over 60 prominent black residents throughout the metropolitan area. Each file included photographs, home addresses, vehicle information, work schedules, and what Cain called threat assessments. The threat assessments had nothing to do with actual criminal activity and everything to do with how successful or visible these individuals were in their communities. Dr. Michael Franklin, a renowned cardiovascular surgeon, had been stopped 11 times in 2 years while driving to and from the hospital where he performed life-saving operations. Each stop resulted in extensive vehicle searches and delays that sometimes lasted hours. Kane's files revealed that these stops were coordinated and intentional, designed to harass and intimidate. Sarah Washington, a successful real estate developer who had built affordable housing in underserved communities, had been subjected to bogus code enforcement visits and fraudulent investigations into her business practices. Kane's records showed he had been feeding false information to various city departments to trigger these harassment campaigns. The list went on and on. Business owners, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and community leaders had all been systematically targeted. The common thread wasn't criminal activity or legitimate law enforcement concerns. The common thread was success, prominence, and skin color. Attorney David Brennan worked around the clock building the federal case, while simultaneously preparing civil lawsuits on behalf of Rebecca and the growing list of victims. The evidence was overwhelming, but Brennan knew that police corruption cases often faced unexpected obstacles. Officers had qualified immunity protections, sympathetic colleagues who might tamper with evidence, and union lawyers who specialized in minimizing consequences. But this case was different. The video evidence from Rebecca's security system was crystal clear and damning. The text messages between officers were explicit and undeniable. The pattern of behavior was so extensive that it couldn't be explained away as isolated incidents or poor judgment. Judge Rebecca Lawson made a decision that surprised everyone, including her own attorney. She announced that she would continue presiding over her regular caseload while the federal prosecution moved forward. Many people urged her to take time off, to step away from the bench until the situation resolved, but Rebecca refused. She explained that stepping down would send the wrong message to the community and to other potential victims. It would suggest that the officers had succeeded in intimidating her, that their tactics had worked. Instead, she would demonstrate that justice couldn't be derailed by corruption and that the rule of law was stronger than any individual officer's criminal behavior. This decision created some logistical challenges. Security had to be increased around the courthouse. Rebecca received round-the-clock protection, and federal marshals screened everyone entering her courtroom. But she was determined to show that democracy and justice would continue functioning despite the attempts to undermine them. Her first day back on the bench drew national media attention. Reporters filled the gallery, cameras lined the courthouse steps, and legal experts provided commentary on the unprecedented situation. A sitting judge who had been unlawfully arrested was now presiding over cases, while her arresters faced federal prosecution. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. Rebecca used her platform to speak about justice, fairness, and the importance of holding everyone accountable under the law, regardless of their position or authority. Her words resonated far beyond her courtroom and became a rallying cry for police reform advocates across the country. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Kane and Rodriguez was proceeding rapidly. Federal prosecutors had assembled a team of 8 attorneys to handle the complex conspiracy charges. The evidence was so extensive that they needed multiple prosecutors just to organize and present it effectively. Kane's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal early in the process. He argued that his client was a decorated officer who had made some poor decisions under stress. He claimed that Kane never intended to target anyone based on race and that the text messages were taken out of context. The prosecution rejected these overtures immediately. The evidence clearly showed premeditation, organization, and systematic targeting based on racial characteristics. This wasn't a case of implicit bias or unconscious prejudice. It was deliberate, calculated criminal behavior that had violated the civil rights of dozens of victims. Rodriguez's situation was slightly different. Her attorney argued that she was a junior officer following orders from a superior. Phone records showed that she had expressed concerns about some of Kane's methods in private conversations with family members. Her lawyer positioned her as someone who had been caught up in Kane's conspiracy rather than an active participant. But the prosecution had evidence that Rodriguez had participated willingly in multiple incidents beyond Rebecca's arrest. She had conducted illegal searches, filed false reports, and helped coordinate surveillance of targeted individuals. Her junior status might be a mitigating factor in sentencing, but it wouldn't excuse her criminal behavior. The investigation expanded beyond the two arresting officers as more evidence emerged. Detective James Mitchell had provided Kane with confidential information about wealthy black residents obtained through illegal database searches. Officer Robert Hayes had falsified incident reports to cover up unlawful stops and searches. Sergeant Lisa Coleman had supervised several of the targeting operations and helped coordinate the conspiracy. Each new arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Officers who had once felt protected by the blue wall of silence now worried about their own exposure. Some began cooperating with federal investigators, providing information about additional crimes and cover-ups. The police union initially defended all the arrested officers, issuing statements about due process and the presumption of innocence. But as more evidence became public, union leaders distanced themselves from the conspiracy. They eventually hired separate attorneys and focused on protecting officers who hadn't been involved in the criminal